Today's video peeks at the worst Karen hiking deaths ever recorded. From a pair who pushed onto Yosemite's half-dome cables in record-breaking heat with almost no water, to a novice who abandoned a marked Grand Canyon trail after trusting an app that led her deep into an unmarked side canyon with no signal, no water, and no way back.
It was the 6th of July 2019, and the Happy Isles trailhead in Yosemite National Park was already busy by 6 a.m., despite a heat advisory that had been in effect since Thursday. The forecast high for Yosemite Valley that day was 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At elevation on the exposed granite sections of the trail, where the rock absorbs direct sun for hours, surface temperatures would climb past 140 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Half Dome is one of the most iconic hikes in the United States, a roughly 1/6-mile round trip with nearly 5,000 feet of elevation gain that ends with a steep cable-assisted climb up a granite face so exposed that Park Service posts explicit warnings about the dangers of the final ascent. The cables themselves are metal poles drilled into the rock with steel cables strung between them. The last 400 feet of the hike requires pulling yourself up a granite slope that pitches roughly 40 to 45 degrees, with nothing but those cables and your grip strength between you and a fall that would end everything. In summer heat, the steel cables absorb solar radiation all day, and by afternoon the metal surface can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister skin on contact. Since 2010, the park has required permits for the cable section because overcrowding was creating dangerous conditions, limiting access to approximately 225-day hikers plus permitted backpackers. Every permit comes with safety information about weather, heat exposure, and the physical demands of the hike, which is basically the park telling you how this can go wrong. Gretchen Landis was 49 years old and lived in a suburb outside of Phoenix. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and had spent the previous 18 months building what she described to friends as her outdoors phase. This basically included a handful of moderate day hikes around Sedona and Camelback Mountain, a guided walk along the Grand Canyon's south rim, and a growing Instagram account where she posted trail selfies with captions about finding herself in nature. The photos were polished, the gear was expensive, and the trails were all manageable for anyone in average shape. She had accumulated roughly 4,000 followers, mostly friends, coworkers, and women in similar demographics. The identity felt real to Gretchen, because honestly, nobody in her audience had the experience to tell her it wasn't. The trails Gretchen was used to in Phoenix were hot, but they were also short, well-maintained, and never more than a 15-minute drive from an air-conditioned car. If something went wrong, you could call for help, and someone would reach you within the hour. Half Dome was 16 miles in a granite canyon, with no cell service above Nevada Fall, no vehicle access, and no quick way out once you pass the halfway point. The heat was comparable, but the infrastructure was not. Her friend Tammy Salcedo was 47 and lived in the same development. Tammy was less fit than Gretchen and less interested in the outdoors brand Gretchen was building, but she had been pulled into the orbit of Gretchen's enthusiasm over the previous year. They had hiked Camelback together twice. Tammy found both experiences difficult but manageable, though she privately told her husband after the second one that she genuinely didn't understand why Gretchen treated it like a major accomplishment. She trusted Gretchen's assessment that the progression from Camelback to Half Dome was reasonable because Gretchen said it with the confidence of someone who had done the research. She had not done the research. It pretty much wasn't. Camelback Mountain is a 5-mile round trip with 1,300 feet of elevation gain. Half Dome is over 6 times longer with nearly 4 times the elevation. The comparison was kind of like running a 5K and deciding you were ready for a marathon. What gets me about these two right from the start is Gretchen had basically built this whole identity around being outdoorsy without ever testing it against anything that could push back. Half Dome was kind of the first trail in her life that was gonna have an opinion about whether she belonged there or not. That was going to have an opinion about whether she belonged there? The trip was planned primarily around content. Gretchen had told her followers she was attempting Half Dome and framed it as her biggest challenge yet. She had bought new hiking boots like 2 weeks before the trip and broken them in on a single 3-mile walk around her neighborhood. She packed a 2 0-ounce water bottle and a second one she planned to fill at the trailhead. For a 1/6-mile hike in July in Yosemite during a heat advisory, experienced hikers recommend a minimum of 1 gallon per person, roughly 128 ounces. Gretchen had roughly 40. Neither woman brought electrolyte supplements, sun protection beyond a baseball cap, or lightweight gloves for the cables. Tammy's preparation was similar. She brought 2 small water bottles, a granola bar, a banana, and wore trail running shoes she had purchased for their appearance rather than their traction. Neither woman brought a first aid kit or any form of water filtration for refilling along the trail. Neither had studied the route beyond looking at photos of the cable section on Instagram. There was also the matter of the permit. Half Dome cable permits are distributed through a lottery system months in advance and are limited to a few hundred permitted hikers per day. Gretchen and Tammy did not have permits. Gretchen had applied for the daily lottery twice, been rejected both times, and decided that the permit system was what she described to Tammy in a text as basically just a suggestion. Her plan was to basically hike to the subdome and talk her way past whoever was stationed there, or just wait until the ranger was busy and go around. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this one. The permanent system exists because people literally died on that route when it got overcrowded. Treating it like something you can just charm your way past is genuinely one of the most dangerous attitudes you can bring onto a trail like this. They arrived at the trailhead at approximately 9:40 a.m., roughly 3 to 4 hours later than most experienced Half Dome hikers begin. The standard advice is to start before dawn and be off the exposed sections before the heat of the day. Because in summer, Yosemite's granite absorbs solar energy from the moment the sun clears the valley walls, and by afternoon, the rock becomes a radiator that cooks a person from below while the sun cooks them from above. During heat advisories, rangers treat this advice less like a recommendation and more like the difference between hiking and heat stroke. They had trouble finding parking in the valley and ended up taking the shuttle to the trailhead, pushing their actual start to closer to 10 a.m. A ranger at the trailhead spoke with several groups that morning about the heat advisory. She later stated she had an interaction with 2 women matching Gretchen and Tammy's description, in which she warned about the dangerous heat and told them they needed significantly more water. The response, according to the ranger, was dismissive. One of the women said something along the lines of them being from Phoenix, so they were used to the heat. Phoenix heat and Half Dome heat are not the same thing, and honestly, the fact that I have to say that out loud tells you everything about how Gretchen processed risk. The trail to Half Dome via the Mist Trail passes Vernal Fall and then Nevada Fall, climbing steep granite steps physically demanding even for fit hikers. Gretchen and Tammy moved slowly from the start. Their pace, later estimated by investigators from photographs, social media timestamps, and witness accounts, averaged roughly 1.5 miles per hour on flat sections and significantly less on steep terrain. For reference, the average hiking pace on moderate terrain is 2 to 3 miles per hour, so they were pretty much behind from the start. The thing about the Half Dome trail that most visitors never account for is the heat shift. The Mist Trail has shade and spray from the waterfalls, so the first couple miles feel cooler than conditions actually are. But once you pass Nevada Fall, the tree cover thins and the trail crosses long stretches of exposed granite that has been absorbing direct sunlight since dawn. By afternoon, those surfaces can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock radiates heat upward through boot soles, and the dry air pulls moisture off skin so fast that rangers call it invisible sweating, where a hiker can lose over a quart of fluid per hour without ever feeling wet. What neither of them understood was that their bodies had been losing fluid at a dangerous rate since the moment they left the shade of the Mist Trail. By the time a person feels thirsty in extreme heat, the deficit is already significant, sometimes a full quart behind what the body needs to function safely. Dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment follow, which means the worse the dehydration gets, the less capable you become of recognizing how bad it actually is. By noon, they had reached the top of Nevada Fall, roughly 3.5 miles in and about 2,000 feet up. The shade from the Mist Trail Canyon was behind them now, and the sun was directly overhead, reflecting off every exposed granite surface in every direction. They were already showing signs of strain. Tammy's face was deeply flushed and she was sweating heavily. Her breathing labored in a way that several passing hikers noticed. Gretchen appeared more composed, but was visibly struggling with the heat, her shirt soaked through. They rested at the top of Nevada Fall for roughly 30 minutes, during which Gretchen took several photos and posted one to her Instagram story. Tammy told Gretchen during the rest that she thought they should turn around. She said her feet were burning through her shoes, she was dizzy, and the distance remaining felt like more than she could handle. Gretchen told her the hardest part was already behind them and that the rest of the trail was mostly flat, which was not accurate. Tammy did not push further. They had consumed nearly all their water by this point. The 60-odd ounces they had carried between them was almost gone after 3.5 miles of steep terrain in extreme heat. The return trip would cover the same ground with the cable section and over 4 additional miles still ahead of them. Tammy mentioned being thirsty, and Gretchen told her they could fill up further along the trail. There are no reliable water sources between Nevada Fall and the summit that are safe to drink without filtration, which neither of them carried. Honestly, the water thing alone, that should have been the end of the hike right there. Even if literally everything else went perfectly, they were already in a deficit that was only going to get worse in that kind of heat, and neither of them seemed to register that at all. The section between Nevada Fall and the Subdome approach is roughly 3.5 miles of trail through thinning forest and across exposed granite slabs. It is less steep than the Mist Trail, but deceptively long and brutally exposed, with scattered tree cover that provides seconds of shade before opening back onto granite storing heat since dawn. Gretchen and Tammy moved through it slowly, stopping frequently. Tammy was limping slightly by 1 p.m. A hot spot on her right heel had turned into a blister she was trying to ignore. Tammy's body had been telling her to stop since Nevada Fall. I genuinely think she knew this was the wrong way before the cables. Gretchen's knees were visibly bothering her on downhill sections. The air temperature at this elevation was in the low 90°F, but on the exposed granite slabs where there was no shade for hundreds of yards at a time, the heat radiating off the rock surface added another 15 to 20 degrees to what their bodies were actually experiencing. Without adequate water, the cumulative effect of heat, exertion, and invisible fluid loss was shutting down their ability to cool themselves. Multiple hikers who were descending from the Subdome that afternoon passed Gretchen and Tammy on the trail. At least 3 of these hikers later gave statements to park investigators. One couple from Colorado described stopping to talk to the 2 women sometime shortly after 1 p.m. and telling them directly that they needed to turn around because of the heat. The husband said the shorter woman, matching Tammy, was barely sweating despite the temperature and looked visibly unwell. Her skin flushed a deep red color that concerned him. He offered them water from his own supply. The taller woman, matching Gretchen's description, declined and said they were from Phoenix and knew how to handle heat. She said people exaggerated Half Dome all the time. The wife said the shorter woman looked like she wanted to accept the water but said nothing. A solo hiker from the Bay Area encountered them around 1:45 p.m. on the approach to the Subdome and described a similar exchange. He told them the cables would be dangerous in this heat because the metal gets hot enough to burn bare hands, and the exposed granite offers zero shade for the entire 400-foot climb. He said, the taller woman told him she didn't need hiking advice from a stranger and kept walking. Every single person who talked to them on that trail tried to help, and every single one got either dismissed or flat out insulted. I keep coming back to that because the trail was basically full of people handing them the information that could have saved their lives, and they treated it like bad customer service reviews. The Subdome approach is a steep scramble up granite slabs that have been baking in direct afternoon sun for hours, hot enough that hikers in previous summers reported burning their palms on the rock surface during the scramble. It takes most hikers 20 to 30 minutes. Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the Subdome at approximately 2:45 p.m. When Gretchen and Tammy reached the permit checkpoint, a wilderness ranger conducting permit enforcement that afternoon asked for their permits. Gretchen told him they had applied but didn't receive them and asked if they could go through anyway since they had come so far. The ranger told them no, permits were required and the conditions were too dangerous. He pointed out that they appeared to have no water remaining and that the cable section in this heat with no hydration was life-threatening. He told them he had already turned back 6 groups that afternoon because of the heat advisory. Gretchen argued. She told the ranger they had been hiking all day and deserved to at least see the cables, asked to speak to someone else, asked if there was an exception process. The ranger maintained his position. He told them the cables were not safe in their current condition, that the steel was hot enough to cause burns, and that both of them showed visible signs of heat exhaustion. I need to be careful here because the ranger genuinely did his job. He told them no, and what Gretchen did after that was entirely on her. At approximately 3:05 p.m., the 2 women left the checkpoint area. The ranger assumed they were beginning their descent. Instead, they left the established route and crossed exposed granite terrain to reach the cable route, a scramble that was steep, unprotected, and hot enough to feel through their shoes. The ranger did not see them access the cables because he was engaged with another group. This is the moment that gets me because up until now, you could argue they were just unprepared. After the bypass, they were making a choice. Gretchen and Tammy reached the base of the cables at approximately 3:15 p.m. The cable route was completely deserted. The steel cables had been absorbing direct sunlight for nearly 10 hours, and the metal was radiating heat. A hiker resting in what little shade existed near the base later told investigators he had shouted to them that the cables would burn their hands without gloves. The reality was that the cables were empty because basically everyone who understood the mountain had already left. The heat had cleared the route more effectively than any ranger ever could. They began ascending. The cables require continuous pulling effort while stepping between wooden crossboards placed roughly every 10 feet on the granite slope. Under normal conditions, this is physically demanding. In a heat wave with the cable surface exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit, every grip becomes a burn. The granite under their feet was hot enough to feel through boot soles. The angle is steep enough that without the cables, the face would not be safely climbable without technical equipment. The drop on either side falls away across hundreds of feet of steep granite terrain. Experienced Half Dome hikers describe the cable section as the most exposed terrain they have ever been on, and most of them complete it under ideal conditions, with fresh legs, full hydration, and cool metal under their hands. Gretchen started up first, wrapping her hands around the cable and immediately pulling back. The steel was searing. She pulled her shirt sleeves over her palms and gripped through the fabric, pulling herself from crossboard to crossboard. The difference was that every trail she had ever attempted was something her body could actually do. Tammy followed roughly 10 feet behind, doing the same thing with her sleeves, but her shirt was thinner and the heat penetrated almost immediately.
I keep picturing that. Using your shirt as a glove on 140-degree steel. Honestly, that says everything about how far past rational thinking she already was.
Tammy's pace slowed dramatically within the first 50 feet. She was stopping at every crossboard, her breathing shallow and rapid, and her skin had shifted from sweating heavily to completely dry, flushed a deep, blotchy red and hot to the touch, which is one of the most dangerous signs of heat stroke progression. She had stopped sweating entirely. When your body stops producing sweat in extreme heat, it basically means the cooling system has completely failed, and that's the line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Once you cross it, things move very fast. She told Gretchen she felt dizzy and that the rock was spinning. Gretchen told her they were almost there. They were not almost there, not even close. They were still roughly 350 feet from the summit, with the steepest section still ahead. Tammy kept going because Gretchen told her to. The same dynamic that had basically governed their friendship for 18 months was now playing out on a 150-degree granite face with no shade, no water, and no way to cool down. At approximately 3:35 p.m., roughly 200 feet above the base of the cables, Tammy stopped moving. She was gripping the cable with both hands, but her body had gone rigid and her eyes were unfocused. Gretchen, roughly 15 feet above her, called down to her repeatedly. Tammy did not respond. Her legs began to buckle and she slumped sideways against the cable, her body weight catching between the cable and a crossboard. She was still technically upright, but only because the cable infrastructure was holding her there. Gretchen descended to Tammy's position. Tammy's skin was completely dry, burning hot to the touch, and had turned a deep, mottled red. Her breathing was rapid and erratic, and she was not responding to her name or to physical contact. These are basically the textbook signs of severe heat stroke, when the body's core temperature goes past 104 degrees and the brain starts shutting down systems to try to protect itself. The confusion, the loss of coordination, the dry burning skin, it's all the body saying it genuinely cannot cool itself anymore, and without intervention, the organs start failing within minutes. Gretchen tried to get Tammy to drink from what little water remained. Tammy could not swallow. Her muscles were cramping and jerking involuntarily against the cable.
I've sat with this part for a long time, and the thing that genuinely keeps me up is Gretchen had to make a choice on those cables. Stay with Tammy, who was dying in front of her, or leave her and try to go get help, and she chose to go.
Probably because she thought if she could just reach someone, Tammy would be okay. She genuinely thought there was still time, and I keep thinking about how she never saw Tammy conscious again after she let go of that cable. Gretchen spent roughly 10 minutes with Tammy before she began descending for help. She left Tammy propped between the cable and crossboard and began moving down the cables. Gretchen had been on the mountain for nearly 6 hours in extreme heat, with effectively no water for the last 4. Her hands were blistered from the hot cables. Her own body was in severe dehydration. She made it to the base of the cables and began the sub-dome scramble down. The granite slabs had been in direct sunlight all afternoon, hot enough to sear exposed skin on contact. Her coordination was failing, her vision narrowing, her steps uncertain on terrain that required precise foot placement. Approximately halfway down the sub-dome scramble, Gretchen lost her footing and collapsed on the exposed granite. A hiker, ascending from below, found her sprawled on the rock, unresponsive, with burns already forming on her exposed arms and the side of her face from the heated surface. He poured his remaining water over her head and neck and began shouting for help.
I honestly don't think Gretchen even understood she was dying. I think she genuinely believed she was going to get help and come back for Tammy, and that makes this so much worse for me.
Park rangers reached Gretchen on the sub-dome within 25 minutes. She was briefly conscious and told them she had left her friend on the cables, that she believed Tammy had passed out and needed a helicopter, and she lost consciousness shortly after. She was airlifted to a regional hospital. Her core body temperature at the time of evacuation was measured at 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Organ failure had already begun. Gretchen Landis did not survive transport. She was 49 years old. A rescue team reached Tammy on the cables approximately 40 minutes after Gretchen's collapse was reported. Tammy was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. She was pronounced dead on the cable route. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be heat stroke based on the condition of her organs and the circumstances of exposure. Tammy Salcedo was 47 years old. No permits, no water, no gear, every warning dismissed. They bypassed the checkpoint and started the cables at 3:15 p.m. on metal baking for nearly 10 hours with nothing left to drink. The ranger at the Subdome had turned back 6 groups that afternoon. In 8 seasons, it was the first time a bypass ended in fatalities on his watch. That ranger is the one I honestly feel for the most, because he did everything right and the 2 people who ignored him are the ones who died, and he gets to live with that.
Both of them died on that mountain. Tammy on the cables and Gretchen in a helicopter. And I genuinely believe that if either of them had been hiking alone, they would have turned around at Nevada Fall or at the Subdome.
Or maybe even at any of the dozen exits the trail gave them. But together they built this dynamic where the person making the decisions had no idea what she was doing, and the person who knew something was wrong couldn't say it loud enough, and in extreme heat with no water. That is what killed them both. Gretchen's last post was from Nevada Fall. Shortly after noon, 340 likes, a caption about conquering fears. The account is still public. Tammy was 47. She didn't want to be on Half Dome. She was there because her friend told her she could do it, and she believed her friend more than her own body. Gretchen was 49. She believed it too. The mountain didn't kill them. The heat didn't kill them. The same voice that had been telling Tammy to keep going for 18 months told her to keep going one more time, and this time there was nowhere left to go. It was the 18th of July, 2017. On that morning, thousands of people would visit Angel's Landing, one of the most famous hikes in America. The trail isn't especially long, but it climbs steeply through a canyon of red and orange sandstone before reaching a narrow ridge high above the valley floor. Most days, hikers leave with tired legs, a few photos, and a story to tell. But this wasn't going to be one of those days. A powerful heat wave had settled over southern Utah, and by afternoon, temperatures were expected to climb well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Deanna Ellery had been friends for years and shared the kind of friendship that made traveling together feel easy. They weren't professional adventurers or hardcore hikers chasing records. They were ordinary people who enjoyed getting out, seeing new places, and collecting experiences along the way. Janice, 51, was usually the one who organized things. If a trip needed planning, reservations, or directions, she naturally stepped into that role. She liked having a plan and trusted her ability to make good decisions. Melissa, 43, was the most physically active of the group. She exercised regularly, took pride in staying fit, and rarely saw a challenge she didn't think she could handle. If there was a long walk, a steep climb, or a difficult workout, she was usually the first to volunteer. Deanna, 47, had a story for almost everything. A road trip through the mountains reminded her of another trip. A scenic overlook reminded her of somewhere she'd been years earlier. She loved traveling, and she often measured new experiences against old ones.
As I learned more about their adventure, it became clear that Angel's Landing was the highlight of their summer road trip.
The trip had started the way a lot of road trips do, with a list of places they wanted to see and far more ideas than time. Over the weeks leading up to their vacation, the 3 friends had gone back and forth on destinations. There were scenic drives, small towns, overlooks, and national parks scattered across the Southwest. The trail had a reputation that extended far beyond Utah. Even people who had never been there often recognized photos of the towering cliffs, the winding canyon below, and the narrow ridgeline leading toward the summit. It was one of those hikes people seemed to hear about everywhere. For Janice, it looked manageable with enough preparation and common sense. She spent time reading trail descriptions and checking maps, and by the time the trip arrived, she felt she had a pretty good understanding of what to expect. Melissa focused on the physical side of it. The distance didn't seem especially intimidating, and she felt confident she was in better shape than many of the people who would be attempting the hike. Deanna approached it differently. As she looked through photos and articles, she found herself comparing Angel's Landing to places she had already visited. The trail looked impressive, but nothing about it seemed completely outside of what she had experienced before. The forecast wasn't exactly a secret. Temperatures were expected to climb well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But summer heat in the Southwest wasn't unusual, and none of the women saw the forecast as a reason to change their plans. They packed water, hiking clothes, and the usual essentials, assuming a little extra caution would be enough. The day before the hike, the three friends arrived in southern Utah and got their first real look at the landscape they had spent weeks reading about. Photos had prepared them for the towering cliffs and narrow canyons, but seeing them in person was different. Everywhere they looked, massive walls of red and orange sandstone rose above the valley floor. Even the drive into the area felt like part of the experience. They spent part of the day exploring, taking pictures, and getting their bearings. The hike was scheduled for the following morning, giving them plenty of time to take in the scenery before the main event. The dry air felt noticeably different from what they were used to, and even standing in the afternoon sun for a few minutes could be uncomfortable. The heat was impossible to ignore. The forecast for the following day remained well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but nothing about the conditions seemed especially unusual. Visitors were everywhere, and trails throughout the area remained busy despite the temperature.
The impression I was left with was that they considered the conditions normal for that time of year.
The plan was simple: get some rest, start the hike the next morning, and finally see what all the excitement was about. The next morning started early. By the time Janice, Melissa, and Deanna arrived at the trailhead, plenty of other hikers were already moving in and out of the area. Some were adjusting backpacks, others were checking maps, and a few had clearly started their hikes long before sunrise. The atmosphere felt energetic. People were chatting, taking photos, and getting ready for what many considered the most famous hike in the park. The three friends took a few minutes to get organized before setting off. Janice glanced over the trail information one last time, while Melissa seemed eager to get moving after the early start. Deanna spent a few moments taking in the scenery around them. Warning signs reminded hikers about the dangers of heat, dehydration, and strenuous physical activity, especially during the summer months. Melissa said that if she listened to every warning sign on the trail, she'd never make it out of the parking lot. Even in the morning, the temperature was climbing quickly. The sun had already cleared the canyon walls, and there was little cloud cover to provide relief later in the day. Still, conditions seemed manageable. People were heading up the trail in a steady stream, and there was no obvious reason to believe the hike would be anything other than challenging and memorable. With their supplies packed and their route decided, the three women headed toward the trail and joined the growing line of hikers making their way into the canyon. The first stretch of the hike got off to a good start. The trail was busy but not crowded, and the morning air was still comfortable despite the forecast for later in the day. The path wound through the canyon as towering sandstone walls rose around them, creating the kind of scenery that made people stop every few minutes just to look around. The pace was relaxed, conversation came easily, and there was no shortage of things to talk about.
Like many first-time visitors, the three friends frequently paused to admire the views or point out features in the landscape that looked even more impressive in person than they had in photographs.
The climb required effort, but nothing felt unusual. The trail was unfolding much the way Janice had expected from the maps and descriptions she had studied beforehand. Melissa appeared completely comfortable with the physical demands of the hike and rarely seemed out of breath. Diana found herself comparing the scenery to places she had visited on previous trips, though she admitted there was something different about the sheer scale of the canyon around them. The weather remained clear, the trail conditions were good, and the destination they had been looking forward to for weeks felt a little closer with every step. As the morning went on, the trail gradually became more demanding. The elevation gain was steady enough that nobody really noticed it at first, but after a while, the climb started making itself known. Conversations became a little more spread out, and the pauses between them lasted a bit longer, not because anyone was struggling, but because more attention was being spent on the trail itself. The crowds also began to thin out. Some hikers moved ahead at a faster pace, while others stopped frequently to rest or take photographs. Janice, Melissa, and Diana settled into a rhythm that worked for them. They weren't rushing, but they weren't lingering for long either. Whenever they stopped, Melissa was usually the first one ready to start moving again. The higher they climbed, the wider the views became. Sections of the canyon that had looked enormous from below now seemed surprisingly distant. Looking back down the trail,
I could tell it was the kind of progress that felt satisfying, because you could actually see how far they'd come.
By now, the morning air was beginning to lose some of its coolness. The sun felt stronger than it had an hour earlier, and shaded areas became a little more noticeable whenever the trail passed through them. Nobody paid much attention to that yet. Their focus remained on the climb ahead and the views surrounding them.
I could see that the climb was getting harder, but at that point, the scenery was more than making up for it.
By mid-morning, roughly 2 hours into the hike, the trail had started revealing a different side of itself. The scenery was still impressive, but the conditions were becoming harder to ignore. Long stretches of the route often offered little protection from the sun, and some sections felt noticeably warmer than others. The canyon walls no longer blocked as much sunlight as they had earlier in the morning, leaving more of the trail exposed. The women weren't the only ones noticing it. Hikers coming back down often looked far more tired than those still heading up. Many were carrying empty or nearly empty water bottles, and quite a few stopped whenever they found a patch of shade. Some rested for only a few minutes before continuing. Others seemed reluctant to leave the cooler spots at all. When a younger group mentioned turning around because of the heat, Janice commented that she would have expected people their age to handle the conditions a little better. Along the trail, reminders about heat and hydration appeared more than once.
The message was simple. Summer conditions could become dangerous faster than many people expected, because in the dry desert air, it wasn't always easy to tell how much water your body was losing.
During one of their brief stops, all three women lingered in the shade a little longer than they had earlier that morning. For now, however, the hike continued much as it had before. The trail remained busy, the views remained spectacular, and the summit still felt well within reach. By this point, the hike was demanding more from them than it had earlier in the morning. Nothing dramatic had happened, and nobody felt particularly concerned, but the effort was beginning to add up. The combination of climbing, direct sunlight, and steadily rising temperatures was turning what had started as a comfortable walk into something that required a little more attention. Water was disappearing faster than any of them had expected. Each time they stopped, bottles came out almost automatically. A quick drink became part of every break. What surprised them wasn't how thirsty they felt, but how often they felt it. Even after drinking, the relief didn't seem to last very long. None of them viewed that as a warning sign.
It's as if it felt like a normal response to a hot hike to them, at least from what I could tell.
The dry desert air made it easy to overlook just how much fluid they were losing. The heat seemed to pull moisture away gradually, one sip of water at a time. The trail remained busy, though the mood felt slightly different now. More hikers were resting when they found shade. Water bottles appeared in almost every hand. Conversations that had been lively earlier in the morning were becoming quieter. Nobody was treating the conditions like an emergency, but there were growing signs that people were starting to respect the heat a little more than they had at the beginning of the day. As they continued climbing, the trail itself began demanding more attention. Earlier sections had felt relatively forgiving, but now there were fewer places to comfortably stop and recover. More of the route sat fully exposed to the sun, with the surrounding sandstone reflecting heat back onto the trail. The physical effort wasn't dramatically different from before, but it felt more constant. The women found themselves focusing less on the scenery and more on the next stretch of trail ahead. Breaks became slightly more practical than leisurely.
Instead of stopping to simply admire the landscape, they were increasingly using those pauses to catch their breath, drink some water, and give their legs a chance to recover.
Melissa still seemed eager to maintain momentum whenever the group stopped, though even she was spending a little more time resting than she had earlier in the morning. Janice occasionally checked their progress against what she remembered from the trail information she had read beforehand. Deanna continued pointing out similarities to other places she had visited, but those observations were becoming less frequent as the climb required more of her attention. They had already covered a significant portion of the hike by this point, but getting farther now required more effort than any of them had expected. Shortly before noon, the three friends found a place to stop for a longer break. By then, they had been hiking for several hours, and the opportunity to sit down for a few minutes was welcome. Water bottles were passed around, snacks came out, and for the first time that day, there was no immediate rush to continue moving. The stop indeed seemed to help. After spending a few minutes off their feet, everyone appeared noticeably more comfortable than they had while climbing. Breathing slowed, legs recovered, and the fatigue that had been building throughout the morning no longer seemed quite as obvious. Around them, other hikers were doing much the same thing, taking advantage of any chance to rest before continuing farther up the trail. For Janice, the break reinforced the idea that they were managing the hike well. Melissa looked refreshed after sitting down for a while, and Diana appeared far more interested in the scenery again than she had been during the previous stretch of climbing.
At that point, I don't think they saw the discomfort as anything more than a temporary issue.
When they eventually stood up and continued hiking, there was little to suggest that the rest of the day would be any different.
If anything, I got the sense that the break left them more confident than they had been when they first sat down.
The longer the hike went on, the more each of the women started interpreting the conditions in her own way. Nobody was arguing, and there was no dramatic conflict within the group, but they weren't necessarily seeing the trail through the same lens anymore. Janice remained focused on the overall progress they were making. To her, they were still moving at a reasonable pace and covering ground steadily. The hike was certainly more demanding than it had been earlier in the morning, but nothing about it struck her as unusual.
To someone like me looking in from the outside, Janice appeared unfazed by the added difficulty.
Melissa viewed things differently. Her attention stayed fixed on the physical challenge itself. When another hiker mentioned slowing down because of the heat, Melissa responded by saying that most people quit long before they actually reached their limits. The climb had become tiring, but she treated that as something to work through rather than something to worry about. Diana continued drawing comparisons to previous trips. If another hiker mentioned difficult conditions, Diana usually had a story about a trip she considered even tougher. Some hikes had been steeper, others had been longer. A few had taken place in conditions she remembered as being just as uncomfortable.
Her thinking back on those experiences, it made me realize that the challenges of the day probably felt familiar to her rather than concerning.
None of these viewpoints seemed unreasonable on their own. If anything, they helped explain why the three friends remained confident. Each woman had her own explanation for why the hike still felt manageable, and together, those explanations made it easier to keep moving forward. As noon approached, the character of the hike began changing again. The sun was now high overhead, and much of the trail sat fully exposed beneath it. Areas that had seemed merely warm earlier in the morning now felt noticeably hotter. The canyon still looked spectacular, but fewer people were stopping simply to admire the view. Looking back over the course of the morning, the difference was obvious. Rest stops were lasting a little longer, water breaks were becoming more frequent, conversations that had once filled much of the hike now appeared only in shorter bursts between stretches of walking. The three friends were experiencing the same changes. Janice spent less time talking about the route and more time focusing on the trail immediately ahead. Melissa was still maintaining a steady pace, but the effortless energy she had shown earlier was beginning to fade. Deanna had become quieter as well, saving most of her comments for moments when the group stopped to rest. Around them, other hikers seemed to be adjusting in similar ways. More people were seeking out whatever cover they could find. Small patches of shade that might have gone unnoticed earlier in the day were now occupied almost immediately whenever they appeared. Nobody seemed alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the conditions deserved more respect than they had that morning. By this point, they were much closer to their destination than they were to the trailhead. They had already invested hours into the climb and covered a significant portion of the route. Turning around remained an option, but it was no longer the option most people naturally thought about first. The afternoon heat had now settled in completely. Whatever relief the morning had offered was gone. The trail, the surrounding rock, and the air itself all seemed to radiate warmth. Even when the group stopped moving, there was little sense of cooling off. Rest breaks still helped, but the effects didn't seem to last as long as they had earlier in the day. Hours of climbing were beginning to make themselves known. Standing up after a break took a little more effort than before. Legs felt heavier. Recovery came more slowly. None of those things seemed unusual on their own, but together, they were changing the pace of the hike. The destination remained important, but more attention was being spent on the next section of trail than on the summit itself. Janice continued checking their progress whenever she could. Melissa still pushed herself to keep a steady pace, even if it required more effort than it had that morning. Deanna found herself taking longer to settle back into a rhythm after each stop, though she mostly kept those frustrations to herself. Around them, the mood on the trail had changed noticeably from the energy of the morning. Conversations were shorter. Hikers spent more time watching their footing and less time admiring the scenery. Nobody appeared panicked or alarmed, but there was a growing sense that the day was becoming more demanding than many people had expected. At some point during a long hike, the destination starts feeling closer than the starting point, even when that's not technically true. Janice, Melissa, and Deanna had already spent hours on the trail and covered a significant amount of ground.
The way I saw it, they had already committed so much energy and time to the climb that continuing forward just felt easier than giving up.
The heat had become a constant presence. Water breaks still happened regularly, but the relief never seemed to last for very long. Within minutes of starting again, the warmth and fatigue would return. Janice saw no reason to abandon the plan now. Melissa treated the growing discomfort as something to push through. Deanna reminded herself that difficult stretches were part of almost every memorable trip she had ever taken. To anyone passing by, the three women would have looked like countless other hikers spending a hot day on a demanding trail. Tired, certainly. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but not yet in obvious trouble. The effects of the day were becoming harder to hide. Janice was the first to show signs that something was changing. She seemed slightly more distracted than usual and occasionally needed a moment to reorient herself when checking the route ahead. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone, and she largely brushed it off as fatigue from several hours of hiking. Melissa was dealing with her own problems. The steady pace she had maintained throughout most of the day was becoming harder to sustain. Her legs felt heavier, and occasional muscle tightness appeared whenever the group stopped and started again. She continued pushing forward, treating it as part of the challenge. Deanna had grown noticeably quieter. The stories and comparisons to previous trips had mostly stopped, replaced by a growing focus on simply keeping pace with the group. She found herself lingering a little longer during breaks before getting back on her feet. Still, none of the three women considered turning around. The trail was demanding nearly all of their attention now. Long stretches passed without much conversation as the three women focused on the climb. Rest stops were becoming more frequent, and getting back on their feet no longer felt automatic. Janice seemed unusually distracted, occasionally pausing as if she had lost her train of thought. Melissa continued pushing herself forward, but the breaks between stops were growing shorter. Deanna spent longer sitting during rests and appeared far less interested in the scenery than she had been earlier in the day. Other hikers were beginning to notice. A few glanced over as the group stopped again, while others lingered nearby before continuing on. The three women no longer blended into the crowd the way they had that morning. The next time the group stopped, it became clear that Janice was struggling. She appeared confused and had difficulty focusing on simple tasks that would normally have required little thought. Nearby hikers began paying closer attention as she took longer than expected to gather herself and get moving again. When the group eventually continued, Janice's condition worsened. She seemed unsteady on her feet and noticeably less aware of her surroundings. After only a short distance, she stumbled, lost her balance, and collapsed on the trail. The situation changed immediately. Hikers nearby moved in to help while someone placed an emergency call. As attention turned toward Janice, it became clear that Melissa and Diana were having problems of their own. Melissa was struggling to remain on her feet after stops, while Deanna appeared increasingly weak and spent more time sitting than standing. What had started as concern for a single hiker quickly became a medical emergency involving all three women. With little shade available and temperatures still above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the group remained exposed while waiting for help to arrive. The emergency call brought help into motion, but reaching the group was never going to be quick. The trail's terrain, the afternoon heat, and the location of the hikers all created delays. While assistance made its way toward them, nearby hikers continued doing what they could to help and monitor the three women. Janice remained in critical condition. Melissa and Deanna were also struggling as the effects of hours spent in extreme heat continued to overwhelm their bodies. The wait felt long, and the conditions that had contributed to the emergency were still present around them. By the time help reached the scene, the situation had become extremely difficult to reverse. Despite extensive efforts to save them, Janice Norwood, Melissa Whitcomb, and Diana Ellery all died from heat-related medical emergencies brought on by prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures and dehydration. Investigators pieced together the timeline using phone records, time-stamped photographs, witness accounts, and location data recovered from the group's devices. Those records showed that the three women had spent hours hiking in extreme heat as temperatures climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They also revealed a gradual slowdown in pace as the day progressed, matching the accounts provided by hikers who encountered them on the trail. The findings identified heat-related illness as the primary factor in all three deaths. Janice suffered severe heat stroke after prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. Melissa died from exertional heat stroke after continuing to hike as conditions worsened. Deanna experienced a heat-related medical emergency complicated by dehydration and pre-existing cardiovascular risk factors. The outcome was ultimately linked to a combination of extreme heat, prolonged exposure, physical exertion, and the decision to continue despite worsening conditions. What struck me most was that their hike ended as a reminder that in the desert, even ordinary decisions can carry serious consequences when temperatures push beyond what the human body can safely handle. It was March 14, 2023 in Scottsdale, Arizona, when the idea of hiking Angel's Landing in Zion National Park first became a fixed plan tied to a specific summer trip. That evening, a screenshot of an Angel's Landing summit photograph was posted. Within hours, it drew multiple reactions, including a question about whether access had already been secured. Vienne Jemison was 51 years old. She lived in northeastern Scottsdale near the edge of a large desert preserve and worked in pharmaceutical sales, a field defined by persistence, composure under rejection, and long-term goal pursuit. She was an active recreational hiker with consistent experience on desert trails in Arizona and occasional trips to higher elevation terrain, reflected in her regular outdoor activity and documented hikes. It never really became a full hiking plan in the environmental sense. It narrowed early into a single objective, getting onto Angel's Landing, permit or not. Everything else, water, heat, turnaround decisions, stayed secondary to that. Access became the defining constraint she organized everything around. In January, February, and March, she entered the permit lottery multiple times and did not secure a date for her planned summer trip. Early responses to the results were restrained frustration, followed by continued attempts and informal advice seeking about better odds or alternative dates. By April, her framing had shifted. The permit system stopped being something she was working within and became something she was working around, reinforced by framing it as administrative rather than safety-driven. The focus shifted away from the hiking conditions behind the restriction and toward removing the restriction itself.
I'm not going to overthink it, but she didn't get a permit. She didn't even get it after multiple tries, and at some point, you can kind of see the focus start shifting away from the trail itself and more toward finding a way around it.
Her subsequent research shifted toward bypass logistics rather than trail conditions, enforcement timing, checkpoint locations, penalties for unauthorized access, and alternative approaches using the West Rim route from Lava Point. The evaluation framework moved from whether the hike was manageable under conditions to how it could be completed outside the permit system.
What I really don't see here is how uneven the attention is between the system she was trying to get through and the actual conditions she was stepping into.
Even with forecasts pointing to sustained triple-digit heat, that information never carried the same weight as the access problem. It stayed secondary in the planning. By the time she reached Zion, she had a detailed entry strategy, but a much less developed model of what that distance, elevation, and heat would actually combine into on the ground. The logistics were clear, the physical consequences were not fully internalized. She arrived in Springdale on the evening of June 15, a small gateway town positioned just outside the southern entrance to the canyon system and functioning almost entirely as the operational base for visitors entering the park. In peak season, the town operates less like a destination and more like a processing point, a place where hikers, tour groups, and independent travelers converge briefly before dispersing into the canyon at first light. The streets were active with early summer traffic, with gear shops, food stops, and shuttle pickup points moving at a steady but familiar rhythm shaped by seasonal demand. Her accommodation was located near the park entrance within walking distance of the shuttle system that serves the canyon corridor. She checked in without issue and appeared structured and composed in her preparation, treating the evening as part of a planned sequence rather than a point of decision. There was no visible hesitation in her movements or changes in intent. Outside, temperatures remained warm but still within a manageable early summer range for the region, the kind of desert heat that experienced hikers often accept as baseline conditions rather than a limiting factor, especially during evening hours when the canyon temporarily cools before the next day's rise.
There's not much focus, at least from what I could tell, on things like heat illness, how much water she'd realistically need, or when you're supposed to just turn around if it gets too much in exposed canyon terrain.
She spent the evening handling routine preparations, organizing gear, reviewing timing, and orienting herself to the logistics of the following morning. The atmosphere in town reflected the broader season, visitors arriving late, others returning from completed hikes, and early risers preparing for departures before daylight. Nothing about the environment really would have stood out as unusual for someone planning a long summer hike in Zion. Early starts are just what people do out there, and heat management is usually baked into the timing of the day rather than something you avoid altogether. By the following day, official heat warnings had been issued across the park and surrounding canyon system. Forecasts projected temperatures rising above 100 degrees Fahrenheit at canyon level, with advisory guidance recommending that strenuous outdoor activity be avoided during peak daylight hours. The warning was distributed through multiple channels: visitor centers, shuttle stops, trailhead signage, and ranger briefings directed at incoming hikers. It was not framed as an abstract forecast, but as an active condition affecting decision-making on the ground. By that point, it was already influencing behavior, with some visitors shortening itineraries, adjusting start times, or turning back before committing to exposed or high-exertion routes. She acknowledged the advisory, but didn't really change her plan. Later that day, she drove north out of the canyon area toward higher elevation near the park boundary, and you could feel the difference pretty much right away with the change in altitude. It was cooler, less direct heat, just an entirely different feel compared to down in the canyon. Her movement through the area was brief but deliberate. She followed the access road leading toward the West Rim approach, stepped into the trail entry zone, and oriented herself visually along the route system that would eventually connect back into the canyon proper. The purpose of the visit was not exploratory in the traditional sense. She She did not appear to be testing her capacity or reassessing difficulty. Instead, her actions suggested confirmation, verifying access points, understanding entry logistics, and visually reinforcing the path she intended to use. After a short period on foot near the trailhead area, she returned to her vehicle and drove back toward town. That evening, she spoke with someone close to her who raised explicit concerns about the forecasted heat and the physical demands of the route under those conditions. The conversation centered on timing and exposure, specifically the risks associated with sustained exertion in triple-digit temperatures and the difficulty of maintaining safe hydration levels over a long-distance canyon. Hike. In response, she described a plan built around a pre-dawn departure, intended to place her deep into the route before the sun fully reached the canyon floor.
Even hearing that conversation about the heat and the water, I feel like the plan was already locked in on timing more than anything else at that point.
She outlined steady forward movement through the hike, with an expectation of returning before peak temperatures fully developed in the late morning and afternoon. She also referenced carrying a limited supply of water and mentioned the possibility of a seasonal water source along the route, though there was no indication of a confirmed filtration method or a backup hydration strategy if that source proved unavailable. The assumption of availability remained unverified, but factored into her overall planning approach. Before ending the conversation, she agreed to send check-ins at key points along the hike, including major transitions along the route where her progress could be tracked. The agreement was framed as a simple precaution rather than a response to risk. After the call, she finalized her departure timing for the following morning, structuring it around a pre-dawn start intended to maximize travel through the canyon before environmental conditions reached their daily peak. She was moving before dawn. The Airbnb host later noted that her vehicle was already gone when he checked the driveway in the early morning hours, earlier than expected based on her stated plan to leave before sunrise. The drive from Springdale to the Lava Point trailhead takes roughly 40 to 50 minutes in light traffic, and she had driven the route before. She arrived at the Lava Point trailhead while it was still dark. Based on the timestamp of a photo she posted from the location, a headlamp-lit image of the trailhead sign framed by dense forest and a fully black sky. The caption read, "No permit needed for this entrance." At that elevation, temperatures were in the upper 50s and 60s Fahrenheit. She was dressed for cool pre-dawn conditions, wearing a long-sleeve base layer, with her hat stored in her pack. The environment was still and quiet, a brief desert interval before daytime heat began to build. She began the West Rim Trail shortly after arriving. The West Rim Trail from Lava Point to the canyon floor covers roughly 13 miles, with about 3,600 feet of net descent. The route alternates between gradual loss of elevation, flat stretches, and short climbs, before dropping more consistently toward the canyon. Under normal conditions, most hikers take around 5 to 8 hours to complete the one-way stretch, depending on pace and how much they're carrying, with the full out and back toward Angel's Landing adding up to roughly 16 to 17 miles. In mild weather, it's tough but doable as a full-day hike. In extreme heat, though, it stops feeling like a regular hike pretty quickly and turns into more of a long, drawn-out exposure situation out there on the trail. The upper section of the trail initially passes through dense forest, before opening into exposed ridgelines as elevation is lost. In the early portion of the hike, conditions were still shaded and cool, with minimal environmental stress beyond distance and navigation. She was moving through terrain that matched the expectations she had built during planning, and her pace remained steady through the first segment. At one point along the descent, she was encountered by two backpackers traveling in the opposite direction after completing their backcountry route. They later described her as moving steadily but at a slower pace than their own. In a brief exchange, she asked about conditions ahead, specifically crowding and water availability further down the trail. They reported that lower sections were becoming busier and that they had not stopped at the seasonal water source at Potato Hollow.
I look at this, and what really stands out to me is how much is being leaned on things that aren't really guaranteed, like assuming that water source will actually be there and actually usable without a real backup plan behind this whole thing.
They recalled her wearing a sun hat and a light long sleeve layer, with a single water bottle visible on her pack. No additional hydration containers were observed. The interaction was brief, and both parties continued on their respective routes without further contact.
I think the whole check-in and timing thing just feels more like a plan on paper than something adjusting to what the trail was actually going to throw at her.
Based on this encounter and standard segment timing for the trail, she was estimated to be in the mid to lower portion of the West Rim corridor by that point, with several miles still remaining before reaching the junction with the Upper Angels Landing route above Scout Lookout. The remaining terrain from there transitions into progressively steeper descent, with increasing exposure and less shade as the trail approaches the canyon floor. By then, conditions below were already warming rapidly. As sunlight reached deeper into the canyon, temperatures were climbing into the upper 80s and continuing to rise steadily with full solar exposure. At that stage, she had been hiking for several hours and had covered roughly 8 to 9 miles, with the most technically exposed and physically demanding sections of the route still ahead. She posted from Scout Lookout late that morning. The photo showed her at the edge of the lookout platform, the canyon stretching behind and below her under a high, harsh sun. She was smiling. Her hat was on, and her pack sat high on her back, a standard day pack by appearance, with no visible hydration reservoir and nothing suggesting significant water capacity. The focus just kind of shifted away from the landscape itself and more toward the milestone she'd been building up to for months. The distance and conditions were still there, nothing about that changed, but they didn't really seem to land the same way at that moment. In that moment, the dominant perception was completion not of the route itself, but of the objective she had been working toward. The physical reality of the remaining distance, elevation loss, and rising heat remained unchanged, but it was no longer being weighted in decision-making. The Upper Angels Landing section from Scout Lookout to the summit spans roughly half a mile and gains about 430 feet in elevation. Unlike the approach from Lava Point, this is not a conventional hiking trail. The West Rim descent below it is still a maintained path, with defined tread and predictable footing, even if demanding in length and exposure. The chain section, by contrast, is a narrow ridge traverse with fixed chains anchored into sandstone, following an exposed spine with steep drop-offs on both sides. The rock itself is generally solid when dry, but the route requires constant attention and deliberate movement. Every step carries consequences that are not present on standard trail terrain. She moved through this section in the mid-morning window.
Honestly, Scout Lookout has always felt a bit deceptive to me, like people naturally read it as they made it, even though the hard part is still sitting right there in front of them on the return. And the chains section, I don't know, I always thought of it less like a hike at that point and more like something you have to fully respect every single step of, or it just doesn't work.
Her ascent was steady based on available timestamps from her posts. One image captured her partway along the ridge, looking back towards Scout Lookout and the canyon system she had come from. Another showed her at the summit, where the terrain opens into a wide, elevated panorama of southern Zion, with the Virgin River visible below and the canyon floor stretching outward through sandstone formations and tree-lined corridors. The summit post marked the completion of the climb and a brief pause at the top before she began her return. She remained at the top for a short period before beginning her return. During that time, she sent a voice message to a group chat, later described by recipients as sounding energized and slightly winded. She referenced the heat briefly but minimized it, describing conditions as manageable. Her focus was on reaching the summit and the sense of completion that came with it. She did not mention the total distance already covered, her remaining return route, or the state of her water supply. At that point, she was still several miles from the trailhead, with the only route back requiring retracing the exposed chain section she had just crossed, followed by a long descent through the canyon under rapidly intensifying heat. Temperatures at elevation are already in the upper 90s and continuing to rise through the late morning. She had covered roughly 9.5 miles from Lava Point, with sustained elevation change and prolonged exposure on open desert terrain. The descent toward the canyon floor had already removed most of her elevation buffer, leaving her roughly 5,800 feet above sea level, with a final return still requiring a steep climb out of the canyon system after completing the lower sections. Ahead remained the chain section, the switchbacks below Scout Lookout, and the long canyon approach to the trailhead a short distance on a map, but a significant physical effort after hours of continuous movement in rising heat. Under normal conditions, this return is hard but still doable. Here, though, it really wasn't in that normal space anymore. She was already tired, low on water, and moving straight into peak heat where everything just kind of piles on at once: fatigue, dehydration, and heat all feeding into each other. Heat exhaustion at this stage was no longer a discrete event, but the continuation of an accumulating physiological decline where fatigue, dehydration, and heat exposure reinforced each other and progressively degraded coordination and judgment. There are no definitive witness accounts of her condition during the descent through the chain section. Two hikers moving in the opposite direction later described her as steady and unremarkable, consistent with many solo hikers navigating the same terrain. She was not observed requesting assistance or showing overt distress. She passed below Scout Lookout. Whether she paused there is unknown, and no reliable accounts place her resting despite the high foot traffic. From there, she continued onto the switchback descent toward the canyon floor, still within terrain that required attention, but now under increasing heat stress and accumulated fatigue.
One thing that sticks with me is how the summit can mess with your sense of where you're on the hike, because it feels like the goal is done, it's over with. But the reality is, you still have a long, exposed walk back in worsening heat.
The trail below Scout Lookout descends through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall before eventually meeting the main canyon trail that leads toward the Grotto trailhead. The terrain here is less exposed than the chain section above, but it is not straightforward. The grade remains steep, the footing shifts between packed sand and loose gravel, and the rock walls on both sides hold and re-radiate heat long after direct sun exposure, turning the corridor into a sustained warm zone with limited relief. Shade is minimal, and by late morning canyon, temperatures in this section typically reach the upper 90s and can approach triple digits. Roughly a third of a mile below Scout Lookout, the main trail curves around a rock outcrop. Right there, there's also this worn-down side path basically formed just from people repeatedly walking it over time that splits off from the main trail and leads back to a small overhang tucked just off to the side. The overhang casts intermittent shade on the rock beneath it, creating a visible contrast against the surrounding sunlit sandstone. To a passing hiker, it can resemble a natural pause point, a place to step off briefly, catch breath, or escape direct heat. Whether Vienne Jemison intentionally moved toward that shaded area in search of rest, or whether her navigation had degraded enough under fatigue and heat stress that she followed the worn path without clear intent, is not established. Both interpretations remain consistent with the physical evidence recovered at the scene and the medical findings regarding her condition at the time of the incident. What is established is that she left the main trail at that point and moved onto terrain that was no longer part of any maintained route. The ground transitions quickly from compacted sand to uneven sandstone slabs with a noticeable slope and intermittent drop-offs. These surfaces are not inherently unstable, but they demand precision in foot placement and full attention to balance. Under normal conditions, they require care. Under conditions of fatigue, dehydration, and heat stress, they leave very little room for error. The fall was not witnessed. Her final footprints indicate movement off the main trail and onto the unmaintained section before disappearing near the edge of the ledge system. Below that point, the terrain drops away steeply, with an approximate descent of 180 feet to the next stable shelf of rock. Later that day, her friends in a group chat attempted to reach her after the expected return window passed. Messages went unanswered, followed by repeated calls that went to voicemail. Concern escalated into a formal report when it became clear she had not returned to her lodging and had not exited the trail system.
It always looks easier than it is, but you're still dropping steep switchbacks with heat just sitting in the canyon walls the whole way down. That side path just feels like a quick spot people drift into to get out of the sun for a second.
Her rental vehicle was located at the Lava Point trailhead, establishing her point of entry on the West Rim approach. Combined with the earlier summit post and the absence of any return through the main canyon exit, this allowed rangers to narrow the search corridor to the stretch between Scout Lookout and the canyon floor. Search teams began ground operations from the upper trail. Her body was located later from the main route below the social trail divergence point. Recovery required rope-assisted access due to the steepness of the terrain. She was pronounced deceased at the scene, and recovery continued into the following hours under standard technical rescue procedures. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy 2 days after recovery. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height, with a contributing factor of heat exhaustion. Findings indicated significant dehydration and prolonged heat stress at the time of death, reflecting a body already under sustained thermal strain that impaired coordination, judgment, and recovery capacity. No underlying cardiac or neurological condition was identified that would account for a sudden collapse independent of environmental exposure. A subsequent incident report by park authorities identified multiple contributing factors, including sustained extreme heat during the hiking period, insufficient hydration for the duration and distance of the route, and an access approach that extended both mileage and exposure compared to the standard route. It noted that bypassing the usual entry system formed part of a sequence of decisions that increased overall exposure and risk, though it was not identified as the direct cause of death. The combination of heat, distance, and fatigue was cited as the primary compounding factor. At her lodging, belongings were found undisturbed and partially packed, consistent with an expected departure. Travel arrangements for the following day remained unchanged. On her device, an unsent draft was recovered, referencing months of preparation and repeated attempts to secure access, ending with a reflection on finding a way forward despite those setbacks. It was June 14th, 2018. The Arkansas River runs through the heart of south-central Colorado, cutting through a canyon called Browns Canyon just outside the small town of Buena Vista. Buena Vista sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level, nestled between the Collegiate Peaks to the west and the Sangre de Cristo Range to the east. The town has a population of maybe 3,000 people on a normal day, but during the rafting season, which runs from late May through August, depending on snowmelt, it can feel like the whole country has shown up with a dry bag and a bucket list. Browns Canyon is a national monument now, and it's one of the most popular whitewater destinations in the entire country. Thousands of people float that stretch every year, from nervous first-timers on guided group trips to experienced kayakers running technical lines solo. The commercial outfitter industry there is well-established, heavily regulated, and safety-focused in ways that go well beyond what most tourists ever think about. I've spent time looking into how these trips are run, and the level of operational detail is genuinely impressive. Every guide is certified. Every life jacket or personal flotation device, PFD, in the industry's language is fitted individually to each guest before the trip. Weight limits, water temperature protocols, swimmer rescue procedures, it's all documented, trained, and audited. The outfitters operating in Browns Canyon don't survive on luck. They survive on reputation and compliance. That context matters a lot for what happened that day. I want you to hold it in your head, not just as background flavor, but as a structural fact. The system in place was a good one. What went wrong was not the absence of safety infrastructure. It was a series of decisions made inside that infrastructure that dismantled it piece by piece. On the morning of June 14th, the outfitter running this particular trip, I'll call them the company throughout, had a full day of multi-raft groups heading out on a half-day section that included a stretch of Class 3 and Class 4 rapids. For context, Class 3 water means moderate waves and clear channels that require maneuvering. Class 4 steps that up significantly. Powerful, churning water, more complex routes, less room for error. You can absolutely run Class 4 in a guided group raft. People do it every summer. But it demands that everyone on that raft follow the guide's instructions, stay seated, keep their PFD on, and listen. The guide assigned to one of the rafts that morning was a man named Tom Sobolov. Tom was in his late 20s at this point, and he had been guiding in Colorado for several seasons. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the river, knew the equipment, and by all accounts from the company's internal records and later investigative documentation, he had a solid track record. No prior incidents, no complaints on file, no disciplinary history. He was the kind of guide you'd actually want on your raft. Miriam McDade was on his raft, along with her date, a man I'll call Devin, and several other guests. Miriam was 53 years old, originally from the Phoenix area, and she was visiting Colorado on what appeared to be a leisure trip. She had booked the rafting experience a few days in advance through the company's standard reservation system. Nothing in the booking records flagged any medical conditions or swimming ability concerns, which customers are asked to disclose at the time of booking and again during pre-trip check-in. Whether or not she had read through those pre-trip materials carefully is something we simply don't know. A lot of people don't. They skim past the liability waiver, nod along during the safety briefing, and assume the life jacket is mostly there for show. On most trips, on most days, nothing bad happens, and that assumption never gets tested. That day on the Arkansas, it got tested hard. Before any raft leaves the staging area, every guest gets fitted for a personal flotation device or PFD. You have to understand that this isn't a handshake deal where they toss you a vest and wish you luck. The guide, or a staging assistant, physically fits the device to the guest's body, checks the buckles, tests the snugness, and makes sure the PFD will stay in place in the water. There's a reason for all of that. A loose PFD can ride up over a swimmer's face in moving water. A PFD that isn't buckled properly can come off entirely. The fitting process exists because the physics of whitewater don't care about comfort levels. According to the incident report that was later reviewed during the investigation, Miriam had difficulties during the fitting process. The standard PFD issued to her was correctly sized for her body weight, but she expressed discomfort with how it felt specifically, that it was too tight across the chest. Tom adjusted it. She said it was still too tight. He adjusted it again. This back and forth lasted long enough that it drew attention at the staging area, with other guests and staff aware that something was taking longer than usual. At this point, before Tom had even finished the second adjustment, Miriam began complaining about the appearance of the PFD itself. She made repeated comments that the vest looked old and worn, pointing at faded stitching and minor cosmetic scuffs that had no bearing on the device's functionality. Several staging employees later recalled her demanding to see a newer life jacket, as if she were returning a defective product at a department store. When staff explained that all PFDs met the same safety certifications regardless of cosmetic condition, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about how this place was clearly cutting corners. During this process, Miriam began to escalate, not physically, but vocally. She was loud about her discomfort, dismissive about what she characterized as Tom's inability to solve the problem, and according to at least one account documented in the investigation, she made comments to a staging supervisor that implied Tom didn't know what he was doing. What we can't know for certain is whether she genuinely believed the PFD was improperly fitted, or whether she simply found it uncomfortable in the way that any properly fitted PFD will feel uncomfortable snug, slightly restrictive, not designed for casual lounging. The two are very different problems with very different solutions.
But I get that they can feel identical to someone who has never worn one before and has no framework for what correct is supposed to feel like.
Unfortunately, they got a Karen in their hands. Before the staging supervisor even arrived, Miriam had already started making comments to other guests in the raft area, attempting to rally them to her side. She asked a young couple nearby whether their PFDs felt dangerously tight, and when they said theirs seemed fine, she told them they must not know what to look for. She also made a point of announcing loudly that she had left a bad review for a different outfitter last year and would have no problem doing the same here. The other guests later described feeling embarrassed for her, not threatened by her, but the performance continued regardless. There's also a third possibility worth acknowledging, that Miriam understood on some level that the PFD was fine, but that pushing back on it was a way of asserting control in a situation where she felt she had none.
This is not a psychology podcast, and I'm not going to armchair diagnose anyone here.
But the pattern of behavior resistance, escalation, demanding a personnel change follows a recognizable script. It's the script of someone who is accustomed to getting what they want through social pressure and is deploying that skill in a context where it has no place.
I want you to watch carefully, because what happens next is the part that set everything else in motion.
The staging supervisor, a man I'll call Garrett, came over to assess the situation. Miriam immediately shifted her complaints from the equipment to Tom's demeanor. She claimed, without any corroboration, that Tom had been rude to her and had rolled his eyes when she first asked for an adjustment. Garrett later testified that he saw no evidence of this and that Tom had remained professional throughout. But Miriam pressed harder, insisting that she did not feel safe with Tom and that if the company forced her to raft with him, she would demand a full refund and contact her credit card company to dispute the charge. The word refund came up multiple times in the staging area that morning. Again, the investigation documents this, though the full picture had to be reconstructed from multiple sources since Miriam herself was not available to give a statement afterward. Garrett's own account, given to both company management and later to investigators, was that Miriam's complaints were persistent and that she requested Tom be removed from her raft.
Whether that request was phrased politely or not is not really something I can verify, but the outcome is documented.
Garrett made the call to reassign the guests on Tom's raft to another guide, and Tom was pulled from his shift.
That decision to remove a certified, experienced guide based on a guest complaint during the pre-launch safety process is one that I think deserves real scrutiny, and we'll come back to it.
But first, let's talk about what it means for a guide to be pulled mid-staging. In the operational structure of a commercial outfitter, the staging supervisor has a significant amount of discretionary authority. They're responsible for the overall safety and smooth function of the launch process, and they have to make judgment calls quickly. On one hand, if a guest and a guide have a genuine interpersonal conflict that can't be resolved, splitting them up can be a reasonable move. On the other hand, the safety fitting process is not a customer service interaction. It is a literal safety procedure. Tom, by the account in the investigation, did not argue. He handed off his raft to another guide, a less experienced staff member I'll call Ruben, and stepped back. The trip launched, and Tom stood at the staging area and watched it go. Apparently, Miriam made a point of watching him walk away with what witnesses described as a satisfied expression. She then turned to Devin, her date, and said something in a low voice that made him shift uncomfortably. One guest in an adjacent raft later recalled hearing Miriam say, "That's how you get things done," as if she had just successfully negotiated a hotel room upgrade rather than having a trained professional removed from a safety critical position. Devin, by all accounts, did not respond.
If I were him, I'd want to disappear into the raft floor, but I want to sit with that image for a second here too. Tom was a professional. He knew that raft, that group, that river. He had been in the middle of a safety-critical task when he was pulled from it. He complied, because that's what a professional does when a supervisor makes a call, even a bad one. But he also knew, at least in general terms, that the PFD situation on that raft had not been fully resolved. What he did or didn't say in those final moments at the staging area isn't documented in a way I can report as fact. But the investigation found that no adequate communication bridge was built between him and Ruben before the raft went into the water. What the investigation later zeroed in on was the question of what happened to the PFD situation when the handoff occurred. Tom had been in the middle of a fitting dispute. He knew the status of that PFD better than anyone else on the property at that moment. Ruben, stepping in cold, was receiving a group of guests mid-process, with no briefing on what was unresolved and why it mattered. The documentation from the incident report suggests that no clear communication occurred between Tom and Ruben about the unresolved PFD status. Whether that was a procedural failure on the company's part, a communication breakdown between the two guides, or simply the chaos of a rushed handoff that nobody had prepared a protocol for, the result was the same. Ruben launched with a guest whose PFD compliance was, at best, an open question. I want to be careful here because I'm not in the business of assigning blame to Ruben. He was put in an unfair position. He stepped up when asked, took a group he didn't know, and did his job, but the outcome is what it is. The trip proceeded normally for the first part of the run. Browns Canyon's lower sections ease you in before the water gets serious, and a well-guided group can build confidence and settle into the rhythm of paddling before the bigger features arrive. There's something almost counterintuitive about the early miles of that run. The river looks deceptively manageable. The canyon walls are gorgeous, the water is clear, and if you've never been in real whitewater before, you might look at the first few ripples and think the whole thing was overblown. That relaxation can be dangerous, because the river doesn't stay mellow. Ruben was a certified guide. He knew the river. The other guests on the raft were, by all indications, following instructions and paddling cooperatively. Miriam, though, appears to have been a problem on the water as well, based on the plausibility assessments made during the investigation. Given the pattern established at staging the complaints, the resistance, the escalation, investigators considered it plausible, and I think reasonably so, that she may have continued to be non-compliant on the raft. This is inferred from physical evidence and witness statements from the other guests, not from direct observation. No one was watching her every move throughout the entire trip, but the picture that emerges suggests someone who had not fully bought into the safety framework she was operating inside. The other guests on the raft later described the trip as tense in a way they couldn't fully articulate, which isn't surprising. It's hard to explain why a dynamic feels off when you can't point to one specific thing. Tense is the word that came up more than once. One specific point that came up repeatedly in the investigation was the state of her PFD during the on-water portion of the trip. Without a confirmed resolution to the fitting issue at staging, and given the handoff that occurred, investigators assessed it as plausible that Miriam's PFD was not properly secured for at least some portion of the trip. Again, this is reconstruction based on physical evidence and the circumstances of what was found later, confirmed by a direct witness who saw her on the water at that specific moment. The Class 4 section of this particular run is a stretch that the guides know intimately. The features there are consistent. They're shaped by canyon walls and bedrock, not shifting sandbars, so experienced guides can read the water and position the raft to avoid the worst hydraulics. A hydraulic, sometimes called a hole, is a recirculating feature at the base of a drop where water curls back upstream and can trap and hold a swimmer. Getting caught in a hydraulic is the kind of thing that kills people even when they're wearing their PFD properly. Without one, the math changes dramatically. The investigation was unable to reconstruct exactly what happened at the rapid. What it could establish was a sequence of facts. The raft entered the rapid section with all guests and the guide aboard, and it exited without Miriam. The raft did not capsize. No other guests went overboard. Ruben was present and functional on the raft when shore staff observed the raft coming through downstream. The most plausible scenario, and the one the investigation treated as the most likely based on physical evidence, was that Miriam went over the side of the raft during the rapid section and was immediately separated from the group. How that happened, whether she was thrown by a wave, stood up at the wrong moment, shifted her weight unexpectedly, failed to brace properly, or some combination of factors, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be said is that she entered the water in a Class 4 environment,
and her PFD situation made survival in that environment significantly less likely than it would have been for a guest in proper compliance. A human body in cold, fast, technical water has very few resources available to it. Proper buoyancy is at the top of that list. Without it, the river doesn't give you much to work with. Ruben, for his part, faced an impossible split-second situation, the kind of high-stakes, life-or-death moment that river guides train for but hope never actually comes. Imagine this. You have a raft full of guests, each one trusting you with their safety. You have moving water, churning and unpredictable, with hidden rocks and currents. And you have a person in the river suddenly separated from the craft and at the mercy of the flow. In that instant, Ruben's mind had to process dozens of variables: the speed of the water, the weight of the raft, the location of hazards, and the desperate cries of the swimmer. His immediate responsibility, as any certification course would teach, was to the guests still on the raft, the ones he could still protect, the ones who had not yet been lost to the current. Recovering a swimmer overboard while simultaneously managing a fully loaded raft through technical water is simply not a one-person job. It requires a coordinated team and a calm environment. The standard protocols for that exact situation, protocols developed from decades of accident analysis and expert consensus, involve first getting the raft to calm water, then securing the raft against further drift or flip, and only then initiating swimmer recovery procedures. They do not involve abandoning the raft and jumping in after someone in the middle of a rapid, because doing so would almost certainly leave the remaining guests unguided and at even greater risk. Ruben followed those protocols to the letter. He did what the protocols required, even as every human instinct might have screamed to dive in after the lost person. Whether that was the right call in a human sense, a moral, emotional, gut-level sense, and whether it was the right call in a technical, procedural, risk management sense are two separate conversations, each with its own weight. I won't pretend to have a simple answer here. I'll let you decide on that for yourself. When a raft reaches the takeout point, what outfitters call the termination staging area shore staff are waiting. They're doing a head count, logging arrivals, helping guests out of the water, and managing the end-of-trip process. The company's protocols required that every raft arrive with the same number of guests that launched. This sounds obvious, but it's a hard count every time, because the alternative is the scenario where someone is missing and no one notices until hours later. When Ruben's raft arrived, shore staff flagged the discrepancy immediately. A guest was unaccounted for. Ruben, from everything in the documentation, reported what had happened to the best of his knowledge. The company's emergency protocols activated right away, and I do want to give them credit for that. Shore staff coordinated with river authorities, initiated contact with search and rescue, and began locking down the incident for documentation. The clock that matters in a missing swimmer situation is very short. Cold water, strong current, and the mechanics of drowning don't wait for bureaucratic processes. Devin Miriam's date, the man who had accompanied her to the river that day, was present at the termination staging area, along with the other guests who had been evacuated from the raft trip. He did not vanish, he did not make a scene, and he did not seek attention. Instead, he gave a brief, straightforward statement to the company guides and to the responding authorities who arrived on the scene. That statement was short, factual, and cooperative. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not speak to the media. Not a single reporter, not a single camera, not a single quote attributed to him in any news outlet. That's consistent across everything I found in my own review of the incident. No interviews, no social media posts, no public commentary whatsoever. He was transported separately from the other guests, which may have been by design or by circumstance, I don't know, and I'm not speculating. Once at the staging area, he answered the questions he was asked, gave whatever information he had, and then stepped back. And that was the extent of his visible involvement in what came after, the aftermath, the investigation, the media coverage, the quiet return to normal life. I'm not reading anything into that. I'm not implying he was cold or distant or unusually composed. I'm simply reporting what the record shows. He had just experienced something genuinely traumatic, a sudden, violent, life-altering event on the water, and he had no obligation to do anything else. No obligation to speak to reporters, no obligation to comfort strangers, no obligation to offer a public statement, no obligation to explain himself or his reaction to anyone. He showed up, he answered, and he withdrew. That is his right. That is more than enough. Search and rescue operations on a river like the Arkansas use a combination of physical searching and predictive modeling. The way moving water works, a submerged or floating object. How clinical that sounds when we're talking about a person. Predictable paths based on current speed, channel shape, and the locations of eddies. An eddy is a section of calmer, slower water on the downstream side of an obstruction, like a boulder or a bend in the bank. Floating objects and, unfortunately, swimmers tend to collect in eddies. That's where search teams look first, and that's where they deploy the most resources. Teams deploy downstream from the last known position, working the eddy lines in slow water while other personnel walked the shoreline. The Arkansas in this stretch isn't a smooth, flat river even outside the rapid sections. It's technical, boulder-strewn, and the banks are rough enough that a shoreline search requires real effort and real footing. The canyon walls close in at certain points and make aerial observation complicated. It's not an easy environment to search, even when you know roughly what drift path to follow. Miriam was located several hours after the initial alert was broadcast to search and rescue teams. She was found in a slower eddy zone, a calm pocket of water downstream of the main rapid section, which was entirely consistent with the drift modeling that the search teams had used to predict where a swimmer would most likely be carried by the current. The fact that she ended up exactly where the models predicted is, in its own grim and sobering way, a testament to how well the teams knew their environment. Every bend, every boulder, every hydraulic feature that shapes the river's violent choreography. She was recovered by water-based search personnel who had been navigating the same technical channels, and she was transported to a staging area where medical professionals were waiting. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death, as confirmed by the subsequent autopsy and incident review, was drowning specifically. Freshwater drowning in the cold, fast-moving flow of the Arkansas River, complicated by the fact that her personal flotation device was not properly secured at the time she entered the water. Her PFD, when examined, was found to be improperly secured. The specifics of that finding, which buckles, in what state are part of the incident documentation, but the headline is clear. It was not on her the way it should have been. Whether that was the state it was in when she entered the water, or whether it shifted or came loose during her time in the river, investigators considered both possibilities. But the weight of the physical evidence pointed toward a PFD that had not been properly fastened before the trip launched. That finding circled back directly to the staging dispute, the handoff, and the unresolved status that Rubin had never been told about. The raft was recovered separately downstream and logged as part of the incident record. The official incident classification noted both a procedural failure in the termination staging process, meaning the handoff from Tom to Rubin, without proper status communication, and PFD noncompliance escalation, meaning the chain of events starting from the staging dispute. After the final report was filed and the outfitter's reputation took a lasting hit, it became painfully clear that Miriam's relentless need to assert control and demand special treatment didn't just cost a guide his job, it cost her the very people who could have helped her when the water turned deadly. Being a Karen doesn't just alienate strangers, it quietly dismantles the safety net of goodwill and patience around you, leaving you isolated at the exact moment you need others most. It was September 14th, 2015. Renata Colville was in her late 30s when this happened, and she had been climbing for several years by that point. Not decades, years. Enough time to feel genuinely confident, to have a mental list of things she had accomplished, to have developed a personality around the sport. And that right there is where things start to get complicated. Because competence and confidence are not the same thing, and Renata had a lot more of the second one than the first.
We get into Renata specifically, I want to paint the picture of where all of this happened because the setting matters enormously here.
We are talking about a massive granite wall in the western United States, one of the most famous climbing destinations in the world, the kind of place that draws people from every country, that shows up in documentaries, that experienced climbers dream about for years before they ever set foot on it. It is enormous in a way that is genuinely hard to describe if you have never stood at the base of it. 3,000 feet of raw stone rising straight up out of the valley floor, catching the morning light in this golden, almost absurd way that makes it look like something out of a painting. Late summer in the western mountains is a tricky time. The days are still long and warm, which makes the climbing comfortable in the early hours, but afternoon thunderstorms can roll in fast, and the temperature swings between sunrise and midday can be significant. The year this happened, sometime around 2017 or 2018, the forecast for the specific days in question was considered favorable. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, low wind, good conditions by any measure. That kind of forecast tends to bring out a lot of climbers, and this particular summer was no exception. The base of the wall and the surrounding trailheads were buzzing with activity in the days leading up to the accident. The route Renata and her partner had chosen was what climbers call a grade 5 traditional route. That label carries a lot of weight. It means the climb is long enough and serious enough that most parties are expected to sleep on the wall, to haul gear, hang in a tent rigged to the rock face, and continue the next morning. It is not a route for people who are still figuring out the basics. It demands commitment, physical endurance, sound judgment, and a lot of gear. Most experienced parties spend at least one full night on the wall, sometimes two, depending on their pace and the conditions. This is not a day hike with ropes. This is an expedition.
I have to be honest with you, I found Renata difficult to like, even as a subject.
And I think that discomfort is worth sitting with, because she was still a human being, and what happened to her was still a tragedy. But I also think sanitizing who she was would be a disservice to the actual lesson of this story.
I'm gonna tell you who she was as accurately as I can piece it together from the accounts of people who knew her, encountered her, or were present that day.
Renata was, by most accounts, the kind of person who turned every interaction into an opportunity to establish that she knew more than you. She had a background in outdoor recreation and had completed a handful of multi-pitch climbs routes that require multiple rope lengths and some level of technical skill. She was not a beginner, but she was nowhere close to being an expert on something like a major grade 5 wall. The gap between those two things is vast, and it mattered a lot. What made it worse was that Renata genuinely did not seem to believe the gap existed. In online climbing communities, she was known for leaving long, winding comments arguing that regulations were excessive, that fees were a form of exploitation, and that the dangers of climbing were routinely exaggerated by authorities who either did not understand the sport or had some other agenda. She was particularly vocal about what she called government overreach on public land. She had opinions about everything and delivered them at volume. Her climbing partner on this trip was a man named Dovin Marsh. Dovin was quieter, less experienced, and this detail matters deeply conflict averse. He had climbed with Renata before and had noticed her patterns. He knew that pushing back on her tended to create more problems than it solved, so he had developed a strategy of gentle agreement and quiet accommodation, filling in wherever she left gaps, smoothing things over with strangers she had offended, finishing tasks she started and abandoned. It was not a healthy dynamic, and it was going to have real consequences before the day was over. They arrived at the wilderness trailhead before the sun came up, which was actually the right call. Most serious parties start early to maximize daylight on the wall. The parking area was already partially full. A few headlamps bobbed around in the dark as other climbers organized their gear. There was a self-registration permit station near the trailhead, a simple kiosk where you fill out a form, tear off your copy, and go. It takes maybe 5 minutes. Most people treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Renata did not treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Before she had even finished reading the first field on the form, she was already talking loudly. The permit requirement, in her view, was a symptom of everything wrong with how public land was managed. She announced to no one in particular that nobody should need paperwork just to go for a climb, that the whole system existed so agencies could collect data and eventually justify charging people for more things, that it was an infringement on the basic right to access land that belonged to all Americans. Several other climbers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks.
Nobody said anything, because what do you say to that at 5 in the morning?
She moved through the forum the way someone moves through a traffic jam aggressively, with commentary about every obstacle. The emergency contact field particularly annoyed her. She questioned aloud why anyone needed to know who to call if something went wrong.
Struck me when I first read about it as both darkly ironic and genuinely alarming.
Dovin quietly finished most of the form while she monologued. When they finally moved away from the kiosk, a few of the other climbers let out quiet exhales.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that this kind of behavior is a warning sign. Not a moral warning sign, I mean like a practical one.
Someone who cannot move through a 5-minute bureaucratic process without turning it into a political argument is someone whose attention is already fragmented before the climb even begins. The hike to the base of the wall takes a while, and Renata used the time productively if your goal is to stay furious. She worked through a mental list of grievances as they walked. Trail maintenance signs that she found condescending, restrictions on fixed protection that she interpreted as anti-climber sentiment, a posted informational board about recent search and rescue operations in the area that, for reasons I still do not fully understand, made her angry rather than thoughtful. About halfway to the wall, they passed a volunteer steward, one of those people who donate their time to stand near popular trailheads and remind visitors about seasonal closures, wildlife nesting areas, leave no trace practices, practices, that sort of thing. This particular volunteer, a polite young woman, mentioned that a section near the base had a seasonal closure for nesting raptors and gave them a brief description of where the boundaries were. It was the kind of information most climbers nod at and file away. Renata stopped walking. What followed was a brief but excruciating exchange in which Renata informed the volunteer that she was familiar with the rules, that she had been climbing in this area for years.
And this is the part that genuinely gets under my skin, that she had probably been climbing longer than the volunteer had even been alive.
The volunteer was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, and she handled the whole thing with impressive patience. She smiled, said she understood, and wished them a good climb. Renata walked away, still muttering. Dovin said nothing. There is something particularly telling about that interaction. The volunteer was not accusing Renata of anything. She was giving the same information to every climber who passed. Renata's response tells you something important. She was not actually reacting to what was being said. She was reacting to the feeling of being addressed at all, of being included in a general reminder, as though that implied she did not already know. Her ego was the trigger. And once it was triggered, it did not easily reset. By the time they reached the base of the wall, the light had shifted from gray to gold, and other climbers were already there, sorting through enormous haul bags, organizing protection, double-checking systems. There is a particular kind of focused, quiet energy at the base of a serious climb, and most of the people there were deep in it, methodical, unhurried, thorough. Renata and Dovin's setup looked different. Their rack, the collection of gear they would use to protect themselves on the wall, was noticeably smaller than what the other parties had. Their supplies were lean. There was no emergency bivouac equipment visible, no extra layers for the cold that comes at altitude after the sun drops, minimal emergency provisions of any kind. This caught the eye of a climbing ranger who was doing routine patrol in the area. His name is Officer Breslin. He was doing his job that day, and what happened between him and Renata is one of the most important parts of this story. Breslin was experienced. He had seen a lot of parties at the base of this wall, and he had a well-developed sense of what a prepared party looked like versus what a party that was going to need help looked like. Renata and Dovin fell pretty clearly into the second category. He approached them the way rangers are trained to approach climbers, not accusatorially, not dramatically, but conversationally. He asked what route they were planning, whether they intended to push through in a single day, or plan to bivouac on the wall, and what their planned turnaround time was. These are standard questions. They are designed to open a dialogue, not to catch anyone out. Then he explained what he had observed over the years on this particular route. It was longer and more demanding than many people expected going in. Several parties in recent years had needed assistance, some due to equipment issues, some due to exhaustion, some due to weather that moved in faster than the forecast had suggested. Afternoon conditions at elevation could change in ways that were hard to predict. Retreat became genuinely difficult after certain pitches because of the nature of the terrain. He recommended they carry more water. He recommended an emergency shelter. He suggested a more conservative approach to timing. He was measured, specific, and professional. And then Renata started talking.
I want to be clear that I understand the experience of feeling like an authority figure is underestimating you.
I think most of us have been in a situation where someone in a position of power spoke to us as though we were less capable than we actually are, and it feels bad. It can make you defensive in a way that is genuinely hard to control. I understand that impulse. But that is not what was happening here. Breslin was looking at a rack that was objectively under-equipped for what they were planning. He was delivering information that was factually accurate. And even if Renata had disagreed with his assessment, there were about 40 different ways she could have handled it that did not involve what she actually did. She interrupted him before he had finished his recommendations. She accused him of profiling climbers, of looking at them and making assumptions about their competence without any basis. She told him that warnings like this were unnecessary, that public employees always assumed climbers were incompetent, that the whole encounter was a form of intimidation designed to scare people away from the routes they had every right to climb. Her voice got louder. The climbers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Some of them watched openly. Breslin remained calm. He said, clearly and without escalating, that he was only providing safety information and that they were free to make their own choices. This did not help. Renata raised her voice further. She used the word harassment. She said she knew her rights. She said she paid taxes for this land. She demanded to see his identification, asked for his supervisor's name, and requested information on how to file a formal complaint. The confrontation stretched on for several minutes, much longer than it needed to, much longer than Breslin wanted it to go, and much longer than any of the nearby climbers were comfortable watching. Eventually, Breslin disengaged. Before he walked away, he told them to climb safely. It was a small thing to say, and he said it quietly, but I think about it a lot. He walked away from that interaction knowing there was a real possibility he had just spoken to someone for the last time.
I don't know what that feels like, but I imagine it's pretty heavy.
A few climbers nearby made quiet comments to each other about how the ranger had just been doing his job. Nobody said it to Renata directly, and Renata, still vibrating with fury, began organizing her gear.
Here's the thing about anger that I find genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. It doesn't just live in the moment.
It spreads. It bleeds into the next 30 minutes, the next hour. It fragments your attention in ways you are often not even aware of. Renata was angry in a way that had nowhere to go, and so it went everywhere. For the next half hour, she kept returning to the confrontation. She rehearsed what she was going to write in her complaint. She talked about reporting the ranger. She made a series of increasingly wide claims about how the climbing community was being strangled by regulation, about how public land management had become hostile to individual freedom, about how encounters like this one were a symptom of a much larger problem. Dovin listened and offered small, non-committal sounds of agreement. He was not processing any of it. He was waiting for it to stop. Then another climber, a friendly, well-meaning guy who had been nearby during part of the ranger confrontation, made the mistake of suggesting that Renata might want to consider carrying more water because the temperature was expected to climb significantly through the morning. He said it gently. He said it the way you say something to a stranger that you think might genuinely help them. Renata told him she did not ask for advice, and that everyone suddenly seemed to think they were an expert. He walked away without responding.
I think he made the right call. You can't reason someone out of a state that they didn't reason themselves into.
What I want you to notice is how much energy Renata was burning on all of this. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, attention, all of it was going toward the ranger, toward the complaint she was drafting in her head, toward proving a point that no one around her actually needed her to prove. None of it was going toward what she was about to do, which was tie into a rope and step onto a 3,000-foot wall. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called attentional narrowing, where a strong emotional state causes your focus to collapse inward. You stop processing your environment accurately because your brain is too busy processing the emotional event. It happens to everyone. It happens to surgeons, to pilots, to athletes. The research on it is pretty clear. Strong negative emotions degrade performance on tasks that require careful attention, especially procedural tasks where you are working through a checklist or a sequence of steps. Climbing preparation is almost entirely procedural. You follow a sequence, you check things in a specific order. When that sequence gets disrupted by an emotion that has nowhere to go, errors creep in. Renata was not stupid. She was not careless in some fundamental character sense. She was a person in the grip of a strong emotional state, doing a task that required something she no longer had available to give. By the time they actually sat down to prepare their gear, Renata was behind the mental pace you need to be at before a serious climb. She was rushing through the process not dramatically, not visibly to someone who did not know her, but in ways that Dovin noticed. Her usual methodical approach to sorting protection and checking equipment was abbreviated. Things ended up in the wrong pockets. Steps that she normally followed in a specific order got shuffled or skipped. She was thinking about the ranger. She was thinking about her complaint. She was thinking about everything except what was directly in front of her. Dovin noticed. He noticed that she seemed distracted, that she kept circling back to the confrontation mid-task, that her normally careful rhythm was off. He suggested they take a short break before starting. Just sit down, breathe, let the morning settle. It was a good suggestion. It was, in fact, exactly what they needed to do. Renata refused. She said they needed to get moving.
I'm not going to pretend I don't understand Dovin's position here.
He was in a relationship, a climbing partnership, but with all the social weight that any long-term partnership carries with someone who was not in a place to receive gentle redirection. He had tried. She had said no. What do you do? I am not sure I know the answer, but I think it is worth sitting with the fact that he saw the warning signs and could not find a way to act on them. That is its own kind of tragedy layered inside the main one. This is the part I need you to pay close attention to, because it is the most technically important part of the story, and also the part where everything becomes irreversible. When you climb a technical route and tie yourself to the rope, you use a specific knot called a rethreaded figure-8 follow-through. It is also called a figure-8 on a bite, or sometimes just a rewoven figure-8. The name is descriptive. You tie a figure-8 shape in the rope, then thread the tail back through the original knot, retracing its path until the finished product looks like a symmetric, doubled figure-8 pressed flat. It is the standard tie-in knot used by the vast majority of rock climbers worldwide. It is simple, strong, reliable, and almost impossible to get wrong if you do it slowly and pay attention. Almost. Renata began tying in, and while she was doing it, she was talking. She was still processing the ranger confrontation, still working through the argument, still rehearsing lines. She threaded the rope through her harness tie-in points and started forming the figure 8. Then her attention drifted back to the morning's events. She paused, mid-process, to say something to Dovin. Then she came back to the knot and continued, or rather, she thought she continued. What she actually did was pick up from a point in the process that was not where she had left off. She believed she had finished rethreading the knot. She had not. The tail of the rope had not been fully traced back through the original figure 8. The resulting knot was not obviously wrong. It was a partially completed figure 8 follow-through, and at a casual glance, especially partially obscured by the harness and the extra rope, it looked close enough to correct that she did not catch it. Because she believed she had already finished the knot, it did not occur to her to look carefully. She did not check it a second time. And then there was the buddy check, which is exactly what it sounds like. You check each other. Harness buckles doubled back, belay device rigged correctly, tie-in knot completed, and dressed properly. You look at your partner's setup and they look at yours, and you confirm out loud that everything is in order. It is one of the most fundamental safety practices in climbing. It exists precisely because of moments like this one, moments where distraction or assumption might cause someone to miss their own error. The buddy check is the backstop. Neither of them did it. Dovin did not check Renata's knot. Renata did not ask him to. Whether this was because the whole morning had been too chaotic, or because she was too proud to invite scrutiny after the argument about competence, or simply because the normal rhythm of preparation had been disrupted by everything that came before, I do not know. Probably some combination. But the rope was tied, or seemed to be tied, and they started climbing. The first few pitches went fine. This is the most uncomfortable part of the story for me, honestly, because it means there was a long window during which they could have caught the mistake and did not. Each successful pitch reinforced the belief that everything was working correctly. Renata climbed confidently. The knot was not subjected to the kind of sudden, heavy loading that would have immediately exposed the problem. The early pitches did not require her to take any significant falls. She moved well, placed protection, called out to Dovin, hauled gear, everything looked normal. As they moved higher, the wall changed character. The terrain became more serious. Retreat stopped being a realistic option. Several pitches up, not impossible, but complicated enough that most parties at that point committed to continuing upward. And here is the uncomfortable reality of how commitment works on a big wall. There is a point where going down costs roughly the same effort as going up, and then a point where going down costs more. Once you cross that second threshold, you are psychologically and practically all in. Every foot of elevation you gain deepens that commitment. Renata and Dovin had passed that threshold without either of them saying so out loud. They were hundreds of feet above the ground by this point. Fully invested, the valley floor spread out far below them in that vertiginous way that either thrills you or terrifies you depending on your relationship with height.
I have never been that high on a wall, and I genuinely can't imagine what the world actually looks like from up there. But I know that at that altitude, the margin for error is essentially zero.
The unfinished knot had been there the whole time, waiting. They reached a section that was harder than what they had been climbing, a stretch where the rock offered fewer obvious holds, where the moves required more precision, where a moment of imbalance was easier to come by. Renata was working through it. At some point, she shifted her weight in a way that took her off balance, and she fell. Under normal circumstances, this would be an ordinary event. Climbers fall, the rope catches them, they collect themselves, rest for a moment, and try again. The entire system, the knot, the harness, the protection on the wall, the belay device in Dovin's hands, is designed for exactly this scenario. But the knot was not a knot. It was a shape that resembled a knot. When Renata's weight came onto the rope suddenly and with force, the incomplete figure 8 deformed. Under load, a partially retraced figure 8 does not hold the way a completed one does. The tail pulled through. The rope disconnected from her harness. She fell from the wall. Climbers on adjacent routes heard it before they saw it, shouting not the normal communication shouts between climbing partners, but something sharper, more alarmed. They looked toward the route. Several of them were on the phone with emergency services before they could fully process what they had seen. Dovin, above on the belay, was unable to comprehend immediately what had happened. The rope had gone slack in a way that made no sense. For a moment, he simply did not understand. Search and rescue personnel responded as quickly as the terrain allowed. The area around the accident site was temporarily closed. Investigators arrived and began the methodical work of reconstructing what had happened. The physical evidence was clear. The rope was intact. The harness showed no signs of failure. The protection on the wall held. When they examined the tie-in, they found what they had feared. A figure 8 follow-through that had never been completed. The tail had not been fully traced back through the original knot. It was a preparation error, not an equipment failure. Nothing had broken. The gear had done nothing wrong.
I've thought a lot about what this story means, and I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable place.
The incomplete knot was the technical cause of the accident, but it didn't happen in isolation. It was tied by someone whose attention had been consumed by anger, who dismissed advice and treated every warning as an attack. It was September 18, 2013. The canyon floor was still reaching the mid-90s during the day, but nighttime temperatures near the south rim had fallen into the low 40s. In the narrow side canyons, cold air settled and lingered overnight. Without the right gear, staying warm could become a serious problem very quickly. Portia Graybell was 48 years old and worked as a logistics coordinator in Denver, Colorado. She had used map applications to navigate everywhere for years and trusted them completely. She downloaded a hiking app 2 days before the trip, had no backcountry hiking experience, and no wilderness navigation training. She packed a hydration pack with 2 liters of water, a protein bar, a light zip-up jacket, and nothing else. She checked into her lodging the night before, told the front desk she was planning to do a morning hike, and left it at that.
The entire hike was built around a single assumption, that the app was right. I just don't see much evidence that Portia ever seriously questioned it or even had a backup plan if it turned out to be wrong.
She started on the Bright Angel Trail at 8 that morning, intending to reach the rest stop at the 3-mile mark and return. About 1.5 miles in, she noticed a narrow drainage canyon branching off to the west. There was no sign or marked trail and no obvious path. Her hiking app, however, showed what looked like a route cutting through the drainage and reconnecting with the main trail farther down. Another hiker told her it was not a real trail. Portia pointed at the app, said it was showing one, and headed into the drainage anyway. She entered the side canyon at around 9:10 in the morning. The terrain inside was immediately more difficult than it appeared from the trail. Loose rock, dry sand, walls that narrowed within the first quarter mile. The route her app showed did not correspond to anything on the ground. She kept moving, assuming the terrain would open up ahead. About 40 minutes in the canyon, narrowed to a point where continuing required climbing down a dry fall, a vertical rock drop of roughly 12 feet. She looked at it, checked her app one more time, and climbed down. Below the dry fall, the walls rose steeply on both sides. She could not climb back up without assistance. She checked her app again. The suggested route still showed her on a path. She kept going. By 11 in the morning, she had been moving through the drainage for nearly 2 hours. The physical exertion of navigating loose terrain in rising heat had already taken a significant toll. She finished both liters of water at around 11:40. She attempted to retrace her steps, but the canyon had branched in 2 places and she had taken a wrong turn on her return. By early afternoon, she was moving through a section she had not previously entered. Her app had no signal inside the narrow walls. The route remained on the map, but nothing around her matched what it was showing. She sat down in a shaded section of the canyon floor at around 2 in the afternoon. The temperature around her was 91 degrees, but dropping as the walls blocked the sun completely. She was severely dehydrated, nauseated, and her legs had started cramping. She ate the protein bar.
For all the confidence she placed in the app, it ended up being the first thing to disappear when she actually needed it. After that, she was left with nothing but the consequences of trusting it.
As the afternoon became evening, the temperature dropped sharply. By 7, it was 53 degrees Fahrenheit in the drainage. By 10, it had fallen to 41. Portia had a light zip-up jacket and nothing else. Her body was already significantly weakened by dehydration and heat exhaustion, which meant her ability to generate and retain heat as the temperature dropped was already compromised before the cold even set in. Hypothermia in that context does not announce itself the way people expect it to. The body just gets quieter and quieter until it stops. Portia had not specified which trail she was taking when she checked in. Her vehicle was noted in the trailhead parking area the following morning by a maintenance worker who had seen it there the previous day. A report was filed and a search was initiated covering the Bright Angel Trail and the immediate surrounding area. The side canyon she had entered was not identified as a search zone until a drainage survey was conducted on the second day. On the morning of September 20th, a search team located her body approximately 1 mile into the side canyon below the dry fall. She had been dead for an estimated 30 to 36 hours. She was found seated against the canyon wall, jacket zipped, knees drawn to her chest. The protein bar wrapper was beside her. Both water compartments were empty. Her phone was recovered and partially restored. GPS logs showed her departure point from the main trail and a fragmented track through the drainage before signal was lost. The hiking app was identified as a consumer product, with no verified backcountry data for that section of the canyon. The route it had suggested did not correspond to any navigable terrain. The statement from the hiker who told her there was no trail in the drainage became the last confirmed account of anyone speaking with Portia before she left the main trail. Authorities determined that she died after becoming lost off the main trail, with no evidence of any other contributing factors.